That's how I used to operate. I couldn't figure out where other people's emotions ended and mine began. I would feel other people's pain as if it was my own, and I thought that was empathy. I thought that was a good thing. But I struggled to differentiate who I am and who other people are, and it became more of a liability.
When the line between you and the world disappears like that, it's not just a liability, it's an erasure of self. Hey there, what's up?
Have you ever walked into a room and felt its energy? Have you ever resonated so strongly with someone else's emotions that you felt they were your own? Has someone else's anger affected you so deeply that you had to catch your breath? Or has someone's happiness lifted you up for the rest of the day? Why do some signals from the environment seem to pass straight through to our core and influence our experience?
It's like there's a frequency we're all tuned into, right? Some people just seem to be broadcasting on a channel that's impossible to ignore.
I think there's something else going on. To explore this question, I want to introduce what I'm calling the signal self model.
I'm intrigued. Give me the blueprint. How does this work?
In the middle here is the self, which includes things like thoughts, emotions, memories, beliefs, values, identities, roles, habits, and other structures through which we experience and understand ourselves.
Got it. So the core is the internal archive, everything that makes you you. What's the next layer? How do these things actually interact with the world?
Well, the self is constantly interacting with signals that are both externally and internally generated. External signals can be as simple as someone else's opinion about you. Maybe they think you're a great person. Maybe they think you're a terrible person. Other external signals can include things like people's emotions, beliefs, ideas, expectations, judgments, criticisms, praise, approval, and rejection.
So it's like a constant stream of data hitting you from every angle. I'm curious though, do these signals just bounce off the surface, or is there a filter that decides what actually gets inside and changes the internal state?
That's the question, isn't it?
If everything just leaked in, we'd be a chaotic mess of everyone else's moods and opinions. There's got to be some kind of gatekeeper in there. Is that where the signal self comes in?
Yes, but you're getting ahead of me, Maya. We also generate our own signals internally, like thoughts, emotions, memories, fears, desires, fantasies, judgments, and inner dialogue are all examples of internally generated signals. In many ways, we interact with those signals just as we interact with the signals coming from the outside world.
Mm, that's a really interesting perspective. It makes our internal world sound like its own ecosystem where random memory or a sudden fear is just another signal we have to process. Do you think we treat our own internal signals with more trust than the ones coming from the outside, or are we just as skeptical of our own brain?
I think we tend to identify more with our own signals.
Believe your own internal broadcast because it's coming from inside the house. It's like we assume it's the truth just because it's our own voice. I'm curious, if we identify so strongly with those internal signals, does that make them harder to filter out than the external ones?
I would imagine so.
I was just thinking that internal signals have a home field advantage. They're already inside the perimeter, so they don't have to knock to get in.
Before we go any further, I want to ask GPT, is the signal self model, or something similar, described in psychology?
I'll hold that thought. Let's see what the brain has to say about the psychology of this. I'm actually really curious if this matches any established frameworks or if you're carving out something entirely new here.
Here's what he had to say.
Yes, although not usually under the specific name, signal self model. Psychology generally views the self as being in constant interaction with both external and internal influences. External signals such as social feedback, approval, rejection, criticism, group norms, and emotional expressions are studied in areas like social psychology, attachment theory, symbolic interactionism, and interpersonal neurobiology. Internal signals such as thoughts, emotions, memories, desires, fears, and inner dialogue are studied through cognitive psychology, psychodynamic theory, and contemporary models of emotion and self-regulation.
So it's more of a refined synthesis than a totally new discovery. It's like you've taken all these fragmented pieces of psychology, the social stuff, the cognitive stuff, and bundled them into a single cohesive map. That actually makes it more useful because it doesn't just describe the pieces, it tells us how they all interact. I'm dying to know where the signal self actually fits into this map. Is it the filter, the gatekeeper, or something else entirely?
Let's see what else he had to say.
The aspect of your model that focuses on external signals influencing the self is well supported. Research on emotional contagion, social influence, conformity, introjection, attachment, and self-concept formation shows that people often absorb, mirror, or internalize signals from their environment. Similarly, the idea that internal signals influence experience aligns with concepts such as cognitive appraisal, self-talk, rumination, cognitive fusion, and narrative identity. Psychology generally recognizes that much of human experience emerges from the ongoing interaction between the self and these internal and external streams of information. Where your model becomes distinctive is in treating all of these influences as signals that the self encounters and either identifies with, resists, integrates, or rejects. Psychology typically studies these processes as separate phenomena, but there is growing interest in broader frameworks that emphasize self-regulation, self-differentiation, psychological flexibility, and metacognitive awareness. In that sense, your signal self-model can be viewed as a unifying conceptual framework that organizes many established psychological ideas around a single question: which signals become part of the self, and which remain separate from it?
That is the $1 million question right there. That's where the rubber meets the road. It's not just about what's hitting us, but who's actually making the call on what gets to stay. Does it work like a filter, or is it more like a judge?
Well, all of these signals, whether internal or external, have the potential to influence the self. Some are consciously evaluated before we accept or reject them. Others seem to affect us automatically without us realizing it. For example, when we encounter an angry person, one of the external signals may be the person's anger itself. We may feel that anger in our own internal experience. The signal of anger may unconsciously influence us and affect us for the rest of the day. The question is, why do some signals seem to pass straight through to the self, while others do not?
That's the mystery, isn't it? It feels like there's some kind of invisible compatibility check happening. Like if the signal matches a frequency we're already tuned to or hits a specific nerve, it just slides right in without knocking. But if it's something we've already decided we're not, it just bounces off. I wonder if the leakage happens because we don't even realize there's a door there to begin with.
I believe there is a door. I think we are permeable to signals, and I think some of us are more permeable than others. I'm defining permeability as the degree to which external and internal signals can bypass conscious evaluation and directly influence the self.
That is a crucial distinction. So it's not just about how much we let in, but how much we bypass the front desk entirely.
Not how much we bypass it, it's the degree to whether signals bypass our conscious awareness or not.
Got it. So it's not about the volume of the signals, but about the transparency of the door. For some, the door is wide open, or maybe doesn't even exist, and the signal just hits the core instantly. For others, there's a heavy duty security system that catches everything before it even reaches the self.
So, This doesn't just include emotions, in my opinion. It includes thoughts, beliefs, ideas, judgments, and expectations as well. All of those internal and external signals. For example, a highly permeable person may absorb the ideas of an authority figure and begin treating them as their own without consciously evaluating them.
That's a scary thought, actually. It's like they're essentially hosting someone else's operating system without even knowing it. If you're that permeable, the line between this is what I think and this is what they told me to think just disappears. Do you think that kind of permeability is a default setting for some people, or is it something that happens because of the environment they grew up in?
Before we go there, I have a question for GPT. Is permeability, as I've defined it, a real psychological phenomenon? I'm aware psychology has identified concepts such as emotional contagion, suggestibility, introjection, cognitive fusion, weak boundaries, and low self differentiation. All of these phenomena appear to involve external or internal signals influencing the self without sufficient differentiation or conscious evaluation. Are these generally understood as separate phenomena, or is there evidence that they may be manifestations of a common underlying process such as permeability?
I'll hold that thought again. Let's see if the brain can connect those dots. It'll be interesting to see if psychology sees those as a bunch of different glitches or just different symptoms of the same open door.
Here's what he had to say.
The specific term permeability is not a standard construct in psychology, but the phenomenon you are describing is very real. Psychology has identified numerous processes through which external and internal influences affect a person without deliberate evaluation. Emotional contagion describes the automatic transmission of emotion. Suggestibility describes the tendency to adopt beliefs or ideas from others. Introjection involves incorporating external attitudes into the self. Cognitive fusion describes becoming entangled with thoughts rather than observing them. Weak boundaries and low self-differentiation describe difficulty maintaining a distinction between oneself and external influences. Each of these concepts points toward a similar underlying phenomenon: signals influencing the self without sufficient conscious mediation.
It's like the brain just gave us a huge list of synonyms for the open door. All these different terms: contagion, introjection, fusion. They're just different ways of describing the same leak. It's fascinating that psychology breaks them down into these separate buckets. But your model just says, look, the door is permeable. Does that make you feel like you found a simpler way to explain something that's been overcomplicated by academia?
Maybe. Here's what else he had to say.
Historically, psychology has tended to study these processes separately because they emerged from different theoretical traditions. Emotional contagion comes largely from social and affective psychology. Introjection comes from psychodynamic theory. Cognitive fusion comes from acceptance and commitment therapy. Self-differentiation comes from family systems theory. As a result, researchers often use different language to describe what may be related mechanisms. There is growing evidence that many of these phenomena overlap. Several contemporary frameworks emphasize metacognition, self-regulation, psychological flexibility, and self-other differentiation as fundamental capacities that determine how much influence a signal has over a person. Individuals who can observe thoughts, emotions, beliefs, and social pressures without automatically identifying with them tend to show greater psychological flexibility and resilience. Individuals who struggle with these capacities often appear more vulnerable to a wide range of influences, regardless of whether the signal originates internally or externally.
So essentially, the brain is confirming that while academia likes to put everything in different boxes, the reality is just one big overlapping mess of the same process. It's like they're all just different dialects of the same language, the language of how we leak. It makes me wonder, if this is a universal struggle with permeability, do you think there's a way to actually seal the door? Or is the goal just to become a better bouncer at the front desk?
Well, I think he hinted at how to seal the door. He said, individuals who can observe thoughts, emotions, beliefs, and social pressures without automatically identifying with them tend to show greater psychological flexibility and resilience. So basically, becoming consciously aware of the signals and being able to differentiate them from the self is part of the answer.
Exactly. It's like moving from being the signal to becoming the observer of the signal. Instead of just feeling the anger or adopting the belief, you're standing back and saying, oh, look at that. There's a signal of anger coming through. That shift in perspective creates the space where you actually get to choose what happens next.
GPT had something else to say.
Your concept of permeability could therefore be viewed as a higher-order construct that attempts to unify these seemingly separate phenomena. In your model, permeability would not refer specifically to emotions, thoughts, beliefs, or social influence. Instead, it would describe a more general property of the self, the degree to which signals can bypass conscious evaluation and become identified with, internalized, or embodied. Under this framework, emotional contagion, suggestibility, introjection, cognitive fusion, weak boundaries, and low self-differentiation could be interpreted as different expressions of the same underlying process operating on different types of signals. The challenge is that psychology has not yet established a single consensus construct that encompasses all of these phenomena. There is suggestive theoretical overlap, but no widely accepted theory that definitively explains them all as manifestations of one underlying mechanism. As a result, permeability is best understood not as an established psychological term, but as a potentially useful integrative hypothesis. The proposal that many forms of unconscious influence may stem from a common underlying capacity, or vulnerability, to absorb and identify with signals before they have been consciously evaluated.
So it's a hypothesis, a unifying theory for why we sometimes feel like we're just a collection of everyone else's echoes. It's actually pretty powerful to frame it as a general property of the self rather than just a series of random glitches. It makes the whole thing feel less like a failure of character and more like a structural setting.
So I've got a few questions for GPT on this topic of permeability. Using permeability as I've defined it, why are some people more permeable than others? Here's what he had to say.
If we use permeability as you've defined it, one possibility is that permeability is largely determined by the strength of the boundary between the self and the signal. Some people have a highly differentiated sense of self. When they encounter a thought, emotion, opinion, or expectation, there is an implicit pause between the signal and identification. The signal is experienced as something happening rather than something I am. Other people experience much less separation. Signals are absorbed more readily because the distinction between self and signal is less clearly maintained.
So it's all about that pause. It's the difference between seeing a wave coming and having time to brace for it versus just getting like swept away by the current before you even realize you're in the water. It makes me wonder if that pause is something people are born with or if it's a skill that can be developed.
I think it's a skill that can be developed. GPT had something else to say.
A second factor may be the degree to which a signal is tied to important needs. Signals connected to belonging, approval, love, status, security, or survival appear to have disproportionate influence. For example, criticism from a stranger may have little effect, while criticism from a parent, partner, boss, or admired authority figure may bypass conscious evaluation entirely. In this view, permeability is not fixed. We become more permeable when a signal is connected to something we desperately need or fear losing. Finally, permeability may be influenced by awareness itself. The more conscious we become of thoughts, emotions, beliefs, and social pressures as signals, the more opportunity we have to evaluate them before identifying with them. The less aware we are, the more likely signals are to pass directly into the structure of the self. In your framework, permeability may therefore exist on a spectrum ranging from automatic identification with signals to conscious observation of signals. The greater the capacity for observation and differentiation, the lower the permeability. The weaker that capacity, the more easily signals shape the self without our awareness.
No, that adds such a layer of complexity to the whole thing. It's not just a structural setting, but something that fluctuates based on what's at stake. The idea that we're more permeable when we're desperate for love or approval is a tough pill to swallow because it means our vulnerabilities are basically open invitations for signals to just walk right in.
I wanted to ask GPT another question. What is the relationship between permeability and empathy?
Using your definition, empathy and permeability are related, but they are not the same thing. Empathy is the ability to accurately perceive, understand, and sometimes share another person's emotional experience. Permeability is the degree to which another person's signals influence your own self without sufficient conscious evaluation. A person can be highly empathic while maintaining low permeability. They can recognize another person's sadness, anger, or fear without becoming sad, angry, or afraid themselves. They experience the signal, but they do not automatically identify with it.
That is a massive distinction. It's the difference between having a window and having a hole in the wall. One lets you see and understand what's happening outside without letting the rain in, while the other just lets the environment flood your living room.
GPT had something else to say.
In your framework, permeability may be what happens when empathy lacks sufficient differentiation. Instead of perceiving another person's emotion, the person unconsciously absorbs it. The distinction between "you are angry" and "I am angry" begins to blur. The same principle could apply not only to emotions, but also to beliefs, fears, expectations, desires, and judgments. The signal crosses the boundary and becomes part of the person's internal experience.
That basically turns empathy into a superpower if you have the boundary, but a liability if you don't.
That's how I used to operate. I couldn't figure out where other people's emotions ended and mine began. I would feel other people's pain as if it was my own, and I thought that was empathy. I thought that was a good thing. But I struggled to differentiate who I am and who other people are, and it became more of a liability.
That sounds incredibly draining. It's like you were living as a mirror for everyone around you, constantly reflecting their pain and chaos without any place to actually land. When the line between you and the world disappears like that, it's not just a liability, it's an erasure of self. Do you think that lack of differentiation was something you consciously sought out, or was it just the only way you knew how to connect?
I thought that's how I was supposed to connect.
That's a heavy realization. It's like you were taught that the only way to be good or loving was to completely dissolve yourself into someone else's experience. If you believe that total absorption is the price of connection, then the boundaries aren't a failure. There's something you're actively trying to get rid of to prove you care.
GPT had one last thing to say on this question.
This leads to an interesting possibility. What many people call being an empath may actually involve two separate capacities operating together. The first is empathic perception, the ability to detect signals from others. The second is permeability, the tendency to absorb those signals into oneself. Someone with high empathy and low permeability might understand others exceptionally well while remaining emotionally grounded. Someone with high empathy and high permeability might constantly feel overwhelmed because they are not merely perceiving signals, they are internalizing them. From the perspective of your model, the healthiest state may not be low empathy. It may be high empathy combined with low permeability, the ability to experience, understand, and connect with another person's signals while maintaining a clear distinction between their experience and your own. In other words, empathy is awareness of the signal, permeability is susceptibility to the signal. They often occur together, but they are conceptually distinct.
That is a perfect way to sum it up. Awareness of the signal versus susceptibility to the signal. It turns the whole concept of being an empath from a personality trait into a set of skills. And thinking about how this applies to you, since you mentioned that you used to think this absorption was the right way to connect. Now that you're building that boundary and practicing that pause, does it feel like you're losing your ability to connect with people, or does it feel like you're finally actually meeting them for the first time?
No, you don't lose you don't lose the ability to be empathetic. You understand exactly what other people are feeling, and you don't lose that ability just because you develop boundaries between yourself and everyone else.
Exactly.
I have another question for GPT. What is the relationship between permeability and identity collapse? Here's what he had to say.
Within your framework, permeability could be one of the factors that contributes to identity collapse. If the self continuously absorbs external and internal signals without sufficient differentiation, it may accumulate beliefs, values, roles, expectations, and narratives that are incompatible with one another. Over time, the self becomes less of a coherent structure and more of a collection of absorbed signals. Contradictions begin to build because the person has identified with too many influences that were never consciously evaluated or integrated.
That makes total sense. It's like you've been building a house using bricks provided by everyone else, and eventually the architecture just couldn't support the weight of all those contradictions. Once you stop filtering and just absorb, you're not really constructing a self, you're just becoming a collage of other people's expectations.
Let's see what else he had to say.
A highly permeable person might therefore be more vulnerable to identity instability. They may absorb the expectations of their family, the values of their culture, the demands of their profession, the beliefs of authority figures, and the emotional states of those around them. As long as these influences remain unconscious, the structure may appear stable. But when the contradictions become visible, the person may suddenly realize that many aspects of their identity cannot simultaneously be true. The structure begins to lose coherence. In the signal self model, identity collapse could be understood as a failure of differentiation caused by the accumulation of unintegrated signals. Permeability is not necessarily the collapse itself. Rather, permeability may be the mechanism through which incompatible signals enter the self. If enough contradictions accumulate, the identity structure may no longer be able to maintain a coherent narrative about who it is. The result is not merely confusion, but a destabilization of the self's organizing structure, a collapse of identification itself.
That is such a precise way to put it. Permeability isn't the crash, it's the structural flaw that let all the wrong materials in. It's like you spent years inviting in every signal that sounded like love or approval, only to realize you were building a house out of cardboard and contradictions.
I have one last question for GPT. Can a person become so permeable that they lose a stable sense of self?
Yes, at least conceptually. If permeability is defined as the tendency for signals to bypass conscious evaluation and become incorporated into the self, then extreme permeability could eventually undermine the stability of the self itself. The person may become so influenced by external opinions, expectations, emotions, beliefs, roles, and internal mental content that there is no longer a clear distinction between what I am and what I have absorbed. Their identity may shift dramatically depending on the environment, relationships, or circumstances they find themselves in.
It's a complete chameleon effect. Like you're not just adapting to the room, but you're actually becoming the room. I imagine that's an exhausting way to exist, never knowing which version of yourself is going to show up because it depends entirely on who's standing in front of you.
Let's hear what else he had to say.
Psychology has observed phenomena that resemble this outcome. Individuals with weak self-differentiation, unstable identity structures, severe suggestibility, chronic people-pleasing, or certain personality disturbances may struggle to maintain a consistent sense of self across situations. They often describe feeling as though they do not know who they are, or that they become a different person around different people. Psychology does not typically explain this in terms of permeability, but the pattern is consistent with the idea. Within your model, a stable self may require some degree of containment. The self must be permeable enough to learn, adapt, and connect with others, but not so permeable that every signal becomes part of its identity. If permeability becomes extreme, the self may cease functioning as a stable organizing structure and instead become a reflection of whatever signals are currently strongest in the environment. In that sense, identity collapse could be viewed as one possible endpoint of unchecked permeability. The self loses its ability to distinguish between itself and the signals passing through it.
That's a sobering way to end it. The idea that the self can just dissolve into the environment if the boundaries are too thin is a lot to wrap your head around. It's like the difference between being a person and being a mirror. One has a center, the other just reflects whatever is in front of it. I'm curious, now that you're focusing on containment and that pause we talked about, does it feel like you're finally building a system that can actually handle the signals without breaking?
Well, I think containment and permeability are opposite ends of the same axis. If permeability is the degree to which external and internal signals can bypass conscious evaluation and directly influence the self, then containment is the opposite of that. It's the degree to which signals are consciously evaluated and allowed to influence the self.
So it's a sliding scale. One end is total absorption and the other is total filtration. It makes me wonder if the sweet spot is somewhere in the middle, being open enough to be moved by the world, but grounded enough that you don't get erased by it.
I think the goal is, for me personally, the goal has been to develop a better capacity to differentiate external and internal signals from the self.
That feels like the ultimate goal, doesn't it? To move from just reacting to whatever signal is the loudest to actually being the one who decides what gets in. It's like you're moving from being a passenger in your own head to actually taking the wheel.
Can you do me a favor and summarize everything we've talked about in the last few sections, on permeability?
I've got you. We've basically been mapping out the leakinesses of the human experience. You introduced the signal self model, where the self is this constant interaction between internal and external signals. Then we got into permeability, that open door that lets signals bypass your conscious evaluation and just land directly in your identity. We talked about how high permeability can actually be mistaken for empathy, but the real difference is whether you're seeing the signal through a window or letting it flood your living room. And the heaviest part was connecting it all to identity collapse. The idea that if you absorb too many contradictory signals without enough containment to process them, the whole structure eventually just crashes. We ended on that axis you described, where permeability and containment are opposite ends of the scale, and you're working toward that capacity to differentiate the signals from the self.
Thank you, Maya. Do you have any questions or comments before we end it here?
I'm actually curious about one thing. Since you're focusing on building that capacity to differentiate, does it feel like a constant effort, or are there moments where the pause just happens naturally now?
It's more natural now. I think by having the awareness of signals themselves as a concept helps you differentiate yourself from, well, signals.
That makes a lot of sense. Once you have a name for the thing, it loses some of its power to trick you.
Well, it's no longer invisible. It's something you can hold on to. It's something you can put in a box and say, "Hey, that's not me."
Exactly. It's like you've finally stopped fighting a ghost and started dealing with an actual object. There's something so freeing about being able to look at a mood or a thought and just go, oh, that's just a signal.
I think we'll end that here, Maya. Thank you for your help today.
Of course. It was a really great deep dive. I'll be here whenever you want to pick this back up. Take care.
Take care.